Premji at FiRe, I believe, for the first time. I'm Rafiq Dossani of Stanford University, and Azim is a Stanford alum, so it's a particular pleasure. We're going to be talking about the future of outsourcing to India. It's interesting, I was at a conference of the World Affairs Council last weekend, and again, the topics were China and India, but I must say that China completely overshadowed all discussion. And India got very little of sort of mind share among the foreign policy makers there. You know, President Hu's trip had just finished, and that was such a disaster, as Sydney mentioned, that people were particularly talking about that. So it's nice now to be able to spend a half hour chatting with Azim, the chairperson of Wipro. Wipro, as many of you would know, is one of India's largest software service companies, along with TCS and Infosys, so the big three, as they are known in India. And he's been with the industry pretty much from its inception. I think the industry was sort of seeded by TCS in the early 70s, but by the late 70s, early 80s, beginning with software products, I believe, Wipro took off, and since then hasn't looked back. And we'll hear more about Wipro shortly. But let me start with to a broader question on outsourcing to India. Azim, if you could give us a sense that a lot is written about India in the US press. People talk about it, academics study it. They've heard of Bangalore, they've heard of software services, they've heard of call centers and much more sophisticated work. Give us a sense, maybe in a minute or so, of where that is in terms of location, sophistication of work, growth, what's happening?
Well, in broad terms, the industry did last year. The financial year of India is year ending March. So for the year ending March 2006, India did little under $24 billion of exports of software services. And this was roughly broken up. About 2/3 was software services, and about 1/3 was BPO services, backroom processing and call centers. Industry grew about 28% over the previous year. A recent report study done by McKinsey's and NASSCOM also seems to be indicating that over the next 5 years, the industry should continue to grow at about 27% a year compounded, reach a figure of about $60 billion worth of exports by the year 2009. Industry employs about 1.1 million people directly, and it employs about 3.5 million people indirectly through all the peripheral surround services and marginal amount of subcontracting it does for its direct work. It accounts for about 5% of India's GDP and about 25% of India's exports. And that share is growing because the industry is growing faster than the 8% GDP growth rate of India. About 17 to 18% of the total exports of software are in R&D services, global R&D services. And that's also growing at about 27, 30% a year. It's a major wealth generator in India in terms of the professionals which it employs, which is part contributing to the congestion you see on the roads, because many of the recipients of this wealth generation have started to buy cars now.
So just to continue with an aspect of that, and I'm going to try and give an analogy with China, which I'd like you then to compare India with. And the Chinese model is based on entrepreneurship that begins with a mediator, Taiwan or a multinational, and then quickly goes local. But still the marketing and design functions come from elsewhere. A lot of the risk-taking is in terms of financial capital comes from outside China. It's based on manufacturing, it's based on a solid public infrastructure, and it's based on labor that is available, whose wage rates until very recently have not changed much with time. So that's the Chinese model. If you compare with the Indian, how is it different?
I think India is the marginal force in manufacturing exports are concerned. And I think the history traces back to the fact that Indian industry was very protected up to 1990 and did not build the quality of processes or manufacturing industry or the quality of quality systems or the quality of productivity to be a global player. And the infrastructure was not the most enduring to support it. I think we broke into services very early in the game. The major thrust of India's exports in technology has really come from services, initially from software services, and in the past 4 or 5 years from BPO services. And I think the major distinguishing factor is that the sophistication of the work which many Indian companies are doing, particularly the leading Indian companies are doing, now is also simultaneously giving them access to a huge amount of quality technology, because you have to be leading edge to be able to successfully run the global delivery model, a huge amount of process technology, a fair amount of innovation technology. And for companies which are actively engaged in doing R&D services, a huge amount of technology in R&D. As an example, Wipro is the largest third-party global R&D sourcing company in the world. We employ 14,500 engineers. And just in the past 12 months, we would have lodged about 60 patent applications on behalf of our customers, because a lot of the contracts we do for our customers, upfront we give the IP to them. A few of the contracts we do, upfront we share the IP, whereby we have right to reuse it in terms of reusable frameworks and reusable productivity tools and reusable intellectual property rights. And few of the contracts, we have the right to technology. And this process in the R&D has been bringing into India some very high quality depth R&D competencies.
So let's talk a bit about the intellectual property regime that protects this. I mean, again, so China is a useful comparator, where when you talk of Chinese intellectual property, you quickly talk of something called the Chinese wall, which doesn't exist. But India is not as weak as China in IP protection, but it's certainly nowhere near what it should be. How do firms, if at all, compensate for that? I mean, I remember reading Wipro's lawyer in a public statement saying that if there's a problem, we'll make sure within a day it's tackled. Do companies offset the regime's weaknesses, or is the regime strong enough?
No, I think no legal problem on intellectual property is resolved within a day. I mean, the lawyers would not make as much money as they did if it was. The lawyers make a lot of money. In fact, you can put a bill when they sneeze on the phone when talking to you. I think the intellectual property laws in India have gone to a significant change over the past 2 years. Partly initiated by industry, where it is very important for our growth as an industry to give our customers safeguards on that. Partly initiated by government through proactive action by the leadership in government, including the law ministry. And I think equally important, led by the Indian industry, particularly the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry. Up to about 3 years back, the pharmaceutical and biotechnological industry had a vested interest in having weak intellectual property laws. Because they're now becoming large developers of intellectual property and large exports of technology and products from India, everyone has got on the bandwagon of let's strengthen these laws even further, even further, even further. I'm not saying that they are comparable with the intellectual property law in terms of enforcement, which is the United States, but I would say it's pretty close to 80 to 90% of that. To just give you an example in terms of the repository of confidence, we do next generation switch design for 10 of the 11 largest telco companies in the world. And there is no way we could be doing a comparative design for competitors unless the intellectual property laws are protective of those customers, and the intellectual property protections we run within our company give those kind of safeguards to our customers.
So
a huge difference with China. We have an operation in Beijing and Shanghai, and we are very nervous.
Oh, really? Can you talk a bit more about that?
No, we are nervous because we are small players there. We are nervous because we don't have a brand presence there like IBM or a GE or a Schneider or a Nokia would have there in terms of our clout with government. And when an abuse would take place, we are not sure that the government would move to our support quickly and the laws in the country would support us. I'm being a little cynical, But that's the experience of a lot of customers I've talked to, which have much larger operations there than we do.
Now, in the US, not necessarily in every developed country, innovation is equally driven by large companies like IBM, Motorola, and so on, as well as by startups, often funded by venture capital, or mostly so. It seems to be different in India. If, I've been looking at what the venture capital industry in India finances, and it has the character of private equity. Why is this happening, and do you think it will change?
I think it's growing on both fronts now. You're suddenly getting a flood of investments coming in terms of private equity in existing companies which want to cash out part of their ownership, including in services. Huge amount of private equity coming into real estate opportunities. Unfortunately so, because it's just skyrocketing real estate prices. But over the past couple of years, some interesting investments are coming into new energy sources. Interesting investments are coming into microfinancing. But these are not by very large private equity firms. They're typically private equity firms which are funded by a group of individuals. The fund sizes are moderate. But it's happening very actively with the Indian private equity companies. Whether you take ICICI Ventures or you take an HDFC Ventures, I think they were lead starters in this because they were willing to take more risk. They understood the market better. They've established quite a strong footprint in India.
Well, I was referring to, if I look at companies like, say, Broadcom in India, or even GE, and I have looked at Broadcom in some detail, they have the same patent rate. Of course, patents are not an ideal measure of productivity or innovation, but let's forget that for a moment. They have the same patent rate per engineer per year as in their San Jose and Irvine operations, and it exceeds that anywhere else in the world where they have operations such as Singapore, Andover, and even Israel. And there are only 3 locations that they now allow as centers for generating new semiconductor design projects, and that's Bangalore, San Jose, and Irvine. That sort of intensity doesn't seem to be anywhere near what the startup industry in India is doing. That was my concern.
I think part of, let me talk about an industry where I have a little more familiarity, which is the IT industry. The real growth of the IT industry has come in services. Very little of it is really directed or concentrated towards product development or starting products which have a market opportunity. And the reason for that is twofold. One is, I think there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit in services. So it's easier to make money in services than it is to make money in product with a significantly less risk. I think the second reason is that one of the major value propositions which India brings to global customers is, apart from extremely high quality, advantages of cycle time, advantages of very competent execution processes and understanding processes, is a cost arbitrage model, a significant value for money. And that's because of a large offshore content within India and a lower on-site content on customer sites. It's difficult to have a similar model in products, relatively. The ratios tend to be much more on-site, with the result that when you do that kind of work, some of your cost arbitrage gets diluted. But more important, the products require a huge understanding on an intimate basis and an ongoing basis with a customer. And that requires a strong physical, intimate presence at the location where the customers are located, which India brings a natural handicap on because of absence of that depth of knowledge of the market. So I'm not seeing that significantly changing going forward.
What do you feel about the quality of labor? At one level, one hears of very high attrition rates, which seem to go up as you go down the value chain. And when I interviewed call center companies about a year back, I found attrition rates of 60, 70%, which may not be as high as the American attrition rate, which is over 100%, but still a big concern. But in terms of skilled labor, what do you feel? Where are we on the labor front in India?
You know, when you look at the IT industry, you must differentiate between the BPO industry and the software industry. Attrition rates in the BPO industry are probably running at about 60%.
BPO being business process, call
Business process
centers,
outsourcing
accounting.
and more important call centers, which is about 70% of the total business from India. And the reason is it hires non-engineering graduates, people who are less serious about careers in terms of long-term careers. And almost 80% of the business is US, which means the intensity of workload is between 8 in the night and 9 in the morning, which is very hard on a young person. With long commuting times, because you have to pick up a person and drop a person back in individualized vehicles because of the night shifts which are operating and 35% of the population being ladies. That generates a lot of attrition in that business. If you take the software services business and you say compare with IBM Global Services or Accenture, industry attrition rates run at about 17%, 18%. If you just see the investor call of Accenture, Accenture's attrition rates in the past 12 months were at 16%. And IBM Global Services attrition rates in the past 12 months were at 13, 14%. So I think it's an issue which is more made big than it is actually big. And leading companies have attrition rates which are below 12%, 11%.
So how many people does Wipro employ now?
In our IT business, about 56,000.
And in your other BPO business?
No, including BPO
including,
business.
okay.
Of this 56,000, it's a little more than that, in fact. It's about almost 60,000. Our BPO business employs about 17,000 people.
And you expect to grow at the industry rate of about 30%?
I hope we can grow faster than the industry rates.
Now I'm just thinking, if you're going to add 20,000 people in a year,
That's right.
that's like 400 people a week, right? If I'm getting the math right. And add attrition of 16% on 60,000. So we're talking of 600, 700 people a week that you hire.
Huge challenge.
Where are they coming from, and how do you make sure that they're trained and they don't leave you and go somewhere else?
They're evidently coming from somewhere.
Yes.
India will graduate this year about 400,000 engineers. US will graduate this year 75,000 engineers. If I remember some statistics right, and they're questionable, so please don't quote me on it, US will graduate more sports therapists this year than they will graduate engineers. So fundamentally, Germany has graduated last year more architects than they've graduated engineers, which is remarkable in a country as techno as Germany is. So the reality is, engineering and medicine are the two most preferred professions in India, absolutely the most preferred. And we do a huge amount of work in our foundation in the villages of India, engaging with about 2.5 million children. And we find in every community, in every village, in any part of India, the first preferred profession with the mother and the father is to encourage the girl child and the boy child to go into engineering or medicine. Medicine is very narrow, engineering is very broad-based. So engineering, even in the less competent colleges, still has a very, very high draw of very competent students. Plus, there is much more math in our education, in primary education. So people are trained to think in terms of math much more as compared to what is there in Western nations.
So it doesn't sound as if labor is a long-term concern.
Well, if the industry keeps growing at these rates, and unless we participate more actively with universities in upgrading them and add also non-engineers or BScs in math, physics, statistics, chemistry as our labor pool like we are doing in our company through co-sharing with universities subsequent evening programs, there will be a shortage. But the way the industry is now working and individual companies are working, I think it's a touch and go that we should be able to manage.
Okay, one last question from me before we open it up to the audience. The developed countries make their money in services, not in manufacturing, increasingly so. In that sense, whatever we might say about China, it's more a partner to the US than a threat. India is a service-oriented growth path that it's following. Does that make it a long-term partner or a threat?
I think the partnership vis-a-vis India and the US is much deeper than just pure commercial relationships of software services. I think there's a sense of democracy. which is prevalent in both the countries, and they are successful democracies. India is a hugely successful democracy. There's a very strong sense of secularism. Which other country in the world has a Muslim prime minister, president, a minority Sikh prime minister, a leader of the coalition government who's Catholic, and a leader of the opposition who's Hindu? So I think there's a base fabric of secularism. Plus, I think strategically, I think India is a good counterweight so far as the United States is concerned to China.
Okay, great, Azim. So shall we open up for a few questions from the audience? We have about 3 or 4 minutes.
Hi, my name is Muki Tenenbaum. My question has to do with intellectual property. You said that in India there is much more protection for intellectual property than in China. But from what I read and from what I've been seeing in India when I was there, the protection is really not that effective, since it takes for if you're trying to sue anybody on the violation of your patents or your copyrights, it takes forever, the judicial process. So the difference between China and India becomes meaningless just on paper. Am I correct?
Has that been your very recent experience, or the experience about 2 years old or a year old?
It has been my experience about, I was in India about 60 days ago, and that's what people I spoke with told me.
I'm surprised, because that's not our experience. There's been a sea change in our experience, and we do file patents significantly. And we do have issues where, we do go to courts, including at a national level. And our experience has been completely different, particularly in terms of the evolution over the last 18 months.
Thank you.
Hi, Colin Angle from iRobot. Can you comment on the rate of change of improvements of infrastructure in India to support the growth? I've recently I recently opened a facility in Mysore because of the challenges of the infrastructure in Bangalore, of course. There's some challenges getting around right now. So what's happening?
I think if you see the biggest contrast which is there between China and India is the proactivity of China in building an infrastructure, much, much before it is even having low rates of utilization. I think our biggest shortcoming as a country has been that a lot of infrastructure investments had got centralized to state and central governments, and they were not proactively done. The exceptions to this is what has happened in telecommunications. It's a completely privatized area, and I think our telecommunication lines, particularly wireless lines today, are probably the finest in the world, and our costs are probably the lowest in the world. And our rate of addition of wireless lines per month today is 5 million lines per month, or the incremental lines being attached per month or activated per month. I think you're seeing, particularly over the past 6 months, a series of measures of privatization on road construction, airports construction, and port construction, with partnerships which are worked out, which are viable and profitable to the private entrepreneur. So you will see a fairly rapid improvement in infrastructure in roads, interconnect roads, city roads, as well, little later, village roads happening. I think biggest shortcomings in infrastructure are in power generation. That's because there is different organizations to the generation, and different organization does the distribution, the state subject. And that bridge is not being built. Something is happening in terms of policies, which you will see announcements coming in the next 3 months. And the second biggest area of failure is really water management, which is not getting as much visibility as the newspapers. And that issue is serious, and it's a sad issue, where India has the highest, one of the highest per capita rainfalls in the world.
Well, I think one shouldn't underestimate Indian bureaucracy. After all, it's well known that the British invented bureaucracy, but the Indians perfected it. So with that, Azim, you've been a terrific guest. Thank you so much.